Welcome back. In this segment, we're going to give an overview of ecology. So we've talked about biodiversity and why it's so important to conserve it. And to conserve Earth's biodiversity, we also have to conserve the ecosystems, the habitats that organisms live in, and the interactions and the ecological processes that organisms have with each other and with their non-living environment. So this is the field of ecology. Ecology is the study of how species interact with their living and non-living environment. So in the background here, you can see a tropical reef with fish and coral and all sorts of critters in here. And you can see that's an ecosystem. There's a lot of ecology going on, a lot of interactions between the living and the non-living environment. So there's a hierarchy to the field of ecology, and ecologists will study one or more of these different levels of ecology. So first of all, you have individual organisms. So for example, this little critter right here, you can study how he survives, how he reproduces, his adaptations that he has that would have come about through evolutionary time. But most ecologists are interested in going higher up in the hierarchy. So we can study populations, which are groups of individuals of a particular species. So for example, here's multiple versions of this critter. I guess he's some kind of rodent. And in population ecology, you'd be interested in figuring out how does this guy distribute himself in an environment? How does he interact with other individuals of his species in that area? And particularly, you're interested in something called population dynamics, meaning how does that population of that organism increase and decrease over time? What factors are involved? And also, population lends itself to studying evolution because evolution acts on populations of organisms as opposed to individuals. So there's another level above that called communities or community ecology. And this is where you're studying how different species interact with each other and with their non-living environment. So this is a very fascinating field. This is where you get into topics like invasion biology, where you're studying introduced exotic species and how they impact ecosystems. How you're talking about how species compete with each other, predator-prey relationships, things like that. And above that, we have the ecosystem level. So this is where you're starting to look at communities of species, but how they are affected by things like nutrient cycling and temperature and these non-living parameters and how those affect populations and communities. And finally, there's biosphere ecology, and that's where you're looking at a global scale, trying to figure out all the interactions that are going on between organisms at the individual, population, community, and ecosystem levels, and how those interactions are influenced by biosphere issues like global climate change and pollution and things like that. So that's kind of the breakdown of ecology, and most ecologists don't just stick to one level. There's too many cool stuff to study, so we usually jump around to multiple levels. I myself would consider myself a combination of a population ecologist, a community ecologist, and I guess a biosphere ecologist. So let's focus in this lecture on population ecology. So again, population ecology, you're looking at the spatial structures of populations, you're looking at population dynamics, and you're also looking at the genetic structure of populations, like how much genetic variation is within a population and how much genetic variation is among populations. Because you might remember that genetic variation is a major key towards conserving biodiversity. So you have to have genetic variability in a population so that if a catastrophe comes, like a new virus or something like that, that there's hopefully somebody in the population that has genes that will be able to allow the organism to survive in that changed environment, and therefore that organism will survive to reproduce and pass that mutation on to the next generation. So back to spatial structure, population ecologists will study a species range, so where geographically it occupies, arrangement within and among habitats within that range. So, do individuals like to clump together? Do they do social distancing? What goes on there? And then population density, growth, and decline. So that's where we were talking about population dynamics, like what's happening with the number of individuals in a population. Are they staying the same? Are they going up? Are they going down? And what factors contribute to that? And finally, patterns of movement of individuals. So are the individuals staying in one place, staying where they were born? Do they emigrate out to an area? Are you having population changes due to immigration coming in? So those are kind of interesting things to study as well. So let's talk about habitats and niches. So you've probably heard the word niche before, like everybody has their niche, right? But it definitely pertains to biodiversity, to living organisms. So the habitat is just the area where a population or a species resides. And in order for it to truly be a habitat, it has to have adequate resources where that species resides. And so you probably can come up in your own head with what would be an adequate resource. So some of the obvious ones would be things like adequate food and water. Of course, that needs to be clean water, that's going to be able to help that organism survive. But it also includes things you might not think about, things like mates. If you have a population that's all male and they move to a habitat that has good food and water, but there's no females of the species there, then there's only going to be one generation living in that habitat. So you have to have adequate mates and types of mates. You have to be able to recognize those as being mates. So you might need sites for courtship display. So in the case of birds, some birds will only mate with another individual that they recognize their courtship behavior, their song and their dance and how they move. And so for some species, like for example, the greater prairie chicken, which is endangered, it has to have little dirt mounds for the males to do their courtship display in order for the females to recognize them and mate with them. So if you're in an area where there's a lot of habitat destruction and therefore there are no dirt mounds, courtship mounds, that would not be adequate habitat for that species because they wouldn't be able to reproduce. And then for many species, adequate hiding places would be an adequate resource, a limited resource that has to be there, because if you are prone to predators, and you don't have hiding spots, you're going to get sought out by the predators, and that would be the end of you and your population there. So survival of species depends on securing proper habitat. And so you've already learned about habitat destruction as being one of the biggest threats to biodiversity. And when you destroy a habitat, you're destroying the resources that organisms need to survive. So you're just wreaking havoc on biodiversity. And in fact, I would say habitat destruction is probably the #1 threat to biodiversity. Niche. So within those habitats, different species take on different roles in the ecosystem. So we call these their ecological niches. So some of these might be something as simple as food, like certain species would, go after one type of food and someone else would go after another. And so it's having your own niche is a way to avoid competition. Because ultimately, competition isn't good for a species. Competition leads to both species that are competing against each other, lowering their population size. So if you can divide up who does what, then you avoid that competition. So having different food, different times of activity. So for example, most birds might be active during the day, whereas bats are active at night. So they're occupying different temporal niches, which keeps them from directly competing against one another, even if they use the same food source. And then within an ecosystem, some of the niches are very specialized. There are very species that occupy a niche that nobody else does. So for example, there's a species of moth that pollinates a plant in the desert called yucca. So it's the yucca moth. And that yucca plant is only capable of being pollinated by the yucca moth. If you lose the yucca moth, you lose the yucca. And the yucca moth only feeds on yucca. So you lose the yucca moth. So these are what you call specialists. They're specialized towards a particular niche that is not occupied by anybody else, and they can't exploit any other kind of that resource. Generalists, on the other hand, occupy a wide variety of niches. So That would be like this cute raccoon right here. Like, the raccoon, maybe normally in the wild, it would eat berries or something that it finds in the woods. But in an area that has a lot of human activity, it's fine raiding trash cans. So it's a generalist, and therefore can expand its range very broadly. So specialists are critical for biodiversity. A lot of times they'll serve as, for example, what's called a keystone species. So, for example, a wolf would be a top predator in an ecosystem. And if you lose that wolf, you get a domino effect where it leads to extinction of all sorts of other species. So you'll get into that more when you get into a more detailed lecture about ecology. But specialists are critical for biodiversity, but they're also the species that are most vulnerable to extinction, because if they lose what they're dependent on in their very narrow niche, you lose them. Generalists, on the other hand, if you have a variable environment, they do really well, because if they lose one resource, they got other resources they can exploit. You also tend to have introduced exotic species often are generalists, and therefore when they get into a new area, they often outcompete native species, which tend to be more specialists because they've evolved to that particular habitat, whereas the introduced species hasn't evolved in that habitat, so it's not dependent on that habitat. More on that in a future lecture. So moving on in population ecology. So we mentioned that the movement of organisms is something that's very interesting to ecologists. So one kind of movement is called dispersal. So this dispersal is movement away from the birthplace. So that means you were born in one place, but you ended up somewhere else. So a lot of us probably experience that. A lot of us don't live in the exact same place that we were born. And so you see this a lot of times if they're in introduced species. So they were born in one place, like, for example, the Asian tiger mosquito was originally evolved in places like Japan, but it hitched rides and used tires, and now it's all over the United States. So it had dispersal from its native area. But sometimes organisms will choose to leave their birthplace because there was maybe inadequate resources in that area. And so in order to survive, they had to migrate to other areas. They had to disperse. And in some cases, and this is particularly true with plants, but it's also true with animals as well, sometimes organisms will disperse away from the birthplace to avoid inbreeding. Because if you stay in the same area you were born, chances are you're going to be related to everybody in that area. And so that would produce inbreeding. We even see this in humans to an extent. But there are plants that can only be dispersed. Their seeds get dispersed distances away from the home area where they were born, where the seeds were produced, and they can only breed with plants away from that base area. In the case of things like primates, like golden lion tamarins, these cute cuddly orange monkeys that are highly endangered in Brazil, kind of like with humans, when the offspring get to be a certain age, the parents will actually kick them out so that they will go and breed with another family, and therefore that avoids inbreeding. In contrast to dispersal, which was movement away from the birthplace, dispersion is movement within a population, within an area. So, some organisms will choose to distance themselves from other individuals of the same species. Others will like to clump up with them, and some don't really care either way, and they just create a random dispersion pattern. So imagine each of these little dots was an individual of the species. They're all the same species. In randomness, random dispersion patterns, they're all over the place. You can't see any distinct pattern. So distribution does not depend on the presence of others. And we use this as kind of a comparison point. So studies in population ecology of dispersion will need to know what would be expected if it was random, and therefore you can use that to compare the actual data that you get when you go out and measure the organisms, so you can determine, did they have a random dispersion pattern, or is it something that is non-random, and therefore you can determine, is it clumped or is it uniform, which we'll talk about in a sec. So in a clumped dispersion pattern, individuals tend to clump with each other. So there could be lots of reasons for this. In the case of animals, it could be behavioral, like they choose to. Maybe they want to hang out where they were born, or maybe there's certain mates present in certain areas, so the opposite sex will clump around there. Maybe it's due to safety in numbers. So it could be a lot of different things, or like in the case of mistletoe. So mistletoe that you see about Christmas in Texas, it's very common in the trees around here. It's a parasite of other plants. It's a parasite vine that gets into trees. But you usually see them clumped because the seeds of those mistletoe are carried by birds. So the birds eat the seeds and it comes out their poop. And so whatever tree they happen to land on, they poop out, and that's where the mistletoe grows. So wherever there's clumps of trees, you see clumps of mistletoe. So that would be a clumped dispersion pattern. So you get these discrete groups because of either social predisposition or clumped resources. Maybe it's not mates. Maybe there's water present, in certain areas, and so individuals clump around there. Or progeny near their parents, like we said. Maybe just stick to where you were born. But another interesting dispersion pattern is called uniform, and this is where individuals deliberately space themselves, or undeliberately, but there's a uniform spacing pattern among individuals. And so this is called hyperdispersion. And it's usually behavioral in the case of animals. And this is really interesting because you see this a lot in birds that are highly populated, like with penguins, for example, or with cormorants. They want to have a kind of a little territory where they can build their nest. And you'll see those nests uniformly distributed throughout an area. So here's an example of a clumped dispersion pattern with salamanders. So they like to stay under logs, so you'll see them clump under logs. And so if you were to go out and measure this and compare it to the random, you would see that they have a clumped dispersion pattern. These Cape gannets, these are seabirds, and kind of like we were saying about the nests, so they're uniformly distributed. This one's my favorite example. These are creosote bushes that are present in the Colorado Desert in Southern California. And they produce a chemical called creosol, which has a very medicinal smell. If you rub some of the little leaves and smell, it's very medicinal. But that chemical is actually toxic even to itself. And so it'll actually put that chemical out into the soil, and that prevents other creosote bushes from growing too close, because then they compete for resources like water. So very interesting. You'll see a uniform dispersion pattern in creosote bushes. So see if you can guess these. So I just gave one away. So these fish here, they're in a school, so they would be clumped. These penguins would be uniform, because you can see how they space themselves, give each other a little space there. And these guys down here, that says spaced, but that's another term for clumped. And down here, random would be like you just go through the forest and the ferns are everywhere, so that would be random. All right, so let's study some population dynamics. And what you see here is a graph that's showing exponential growth, as we call it, of the human population. So we'll go over this in a little bit. So population dynamics is the study of population growth and decline. And there's many variables that are going to be taken into consideration with this. So we have births and deaths, migration patterns, which includes emigration, where individuals leave an area, and immigration, where individuals come into an area. And then other things like age structure and sex ratio. So we'll talk about this. So let's focus on those births and deaths. So if you're studying growth and decline of a population, clearly if you are having more individuals in the population over time, that population is in growth. If you lose individuals, it's in decline. So there are two ways you can increase the number of individuals in your population: through births and through immigration, individuals coming in. And the way you lose individuals is through deaths and emigration, where they leave. So in ecology, there's something called the intrinsic rate of growth, and they use R to illustrate it. That's the rate at which a population is growing as long as there's adequate resources for everybody. So R is those individuals coming into the population, births plus immigrants, minus those leaving the population, deaths plus immigrants. And so in general, if this equation, if R is greater than 0, that means this part is greater than that part. That means there's more individuals coming in than leaving, and therefore your population's increasing. If R is less than 0, then this part of the equation is bigger than that part, and therefore more individuals are dying or leaving than individuals are being born and coming in. So in general, what you're shooting for over time is an R of 0, where the number of individuals entering the population is equal to those leaving, and therefore we have what's called 0 population growth. So this is definitely kind of what we've been aiming for with human population growth. So ecologists are going to use a variable called N, and that's the population size. And you can look at how N changes over time to determine if your population is growing or declining. So this gets into some fancy looking variables here, but dn over dt just means the change in population size over the change in time. So how does your population size change as time changes? That's your population change, and that's going to be the product of taking those coming in and subtracting those leaving. And so this change in your population size is going to depend on the balance of births and immigrants and deaths and immigrants. Now, how your population grows or declines is very much a product of evolution. So some individuals, like insects, have evolved to be small, but put out tons and tons of babies all at once. And very few of those babies end up surviving. So in other words, your evolutionary strategy is to be what's called an R strategist. So cockroaches would be R strategists, dandelions would be R strategists, shrimp would be R strategists. So usually they're very small, they have lots of small offspring, really no parental care. The parents lay the eggs and bye, that's it, you're on your own. They tend to reproduce very early in life, and most individuals die before they ever get to reproduce. So they tend to have high population growth rate. In other words, if you've ever gotten some bananas from the store and you find all of a sudden there's tons of fruit flies in your house, it's because there are strategists and they reproduce very, very quickly. So their population size can grow really, really fast. A lot of them tend to be generalists, and they are what you call early successional species. Like if an area gets disturbed, these are usually the first ones in there to reestablish the area. So think bugs, those are our strategists. In contrast, a K strategist is like a human or an elephant or saguaro cactus. So we don't have hundreds of babies at once. We have one or a few babies. We give lots of parental care to make sure those babies are taken care of. We tend to be rather large compared to an insect. And we tend to have like stable climates. We're not generalists. A lot of us are specialists. And our population growth, it happens slowly. We are very good at competing against other species. And we're usually the last to get to a disturbed area. So usually, let's say you had a volcano blow up. The first things that would come in would be like the mosses and then the insects, etc. The last things that would come in would be things like elephants. So depending on your strategy, your evolutionary strategy of being an R strategist or a K strategist or something in between, that is going to influence what's called your survivorship curve. So on the y-axis here, we have the percent of individuals surviving. On the x-axis, the age. So if you take an R strategist like this fish here, notice that this fish is going to have very good survival right at the beginning, but like we're talking about just within a few days of birth. But very quickly and exponentially, most of those individuals are going to die. So you get early loss, and the few that squeak through and live to an older age are going to reproduce and then have a nice, steady lifespan the rest of their life until they reach a ripe old age and die. in contrast, a case strategist like this rhinoceros is going to have really good survivorship early on because of the parental care. So the parents are taking care of them all the way until a certain age, and then at that age, they start dying off really rapidly, exponentially. And then in between would be maybe like this particular bird species where it doesn't really matter, what age they're at. The chance of dying when you're young is the same as the chance of dying when you're old. Whereas a case strategist, the chance of dying when you're young is much lower than the chance of dying at a certain age. And with the fish, chance of dying early on is very high. Chance of dying later on is levels off and is lower. So in the case of the rhino or the case strategist, that's what we call a type 1 survivorship curve. The bird, where you have constant loss, would be a type 2 survivorship curve. And this one down here for the R strategist, this would be a type 3 survivorship curve. So it's kind of interesting to go out and study a species and try to figure out what kind of survivorship pattern it has and what factors affect its survivorship. So I mentioned exponential growth, but I didn't break down yet for you exactly what that is. So the concept of exponential growth is really at the core of population dynamics. So the best way I can think of to explain this up front is with an example. So let's say you had one female fruit fly, and there she goes. And, the average fruit fly is about 7 millimeters long. So, a fruit fly, like when you have the bananas in your house too long. And, on average, a fruit fly female is going to produce about 120 babies all at once. And assuming that they each have 120 babies, and the generation time for a fruit fly is about 10 days. So in other words, the whole life cycle for an individual fly is 10 days. So given that they can have 120 babies and the life cycle is about 10 days, how many fruit flies would you have in 3 months if there was no limit to the resources and everybody got to reproduce before they died? So at this rate, how many fruit flies would you have in 3 months? So think about that for a minute. Well, and the answer is dun, 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 a whole lot of fruit flies. A whole lot of fruit flies. In other words, it would be enough fruit flies to go around the earth, if you were to line them up end to end, about 57,000 times. So in other words, you're going to have 325 trillion fruit flies in 3 months, all descended from that starting fruit fly. And if you line them up 7 millimeters each, they would go around the earth 57,000 times. Put that into some context in your brain there. So why aren't we drowning in fruit flies? Like, it seems like there would be no other species on earth except fruit flies if this is the case. Well, the key assumption here was there was no limit to resources. In other words, these flies, every single fly could get all those resources that they needed. But that's not realistic, right? In life, there are limits to resources. We have limited resources. And when you have limited resources, it creates competition among individuals for those resources. And when there's competition, not every individual is going to be able to survive and reproduce and pass on their genes because they won't be able to acquire the resources they need to do that. So exponential growth is growth that increases by a fixed percentage of the whole. And it's deceptive because, as we saw with the fruit flies there, it starts off slowly. Here's our population size, and here's time. So it starts off really slowly, and at some point, it skyrockets, just as we saw with the fruit flies. And so, therefore, the shape of the curve looks like a J. So exponential growth is a J-shaped curve. So each doubling is more than the total of all previous growth. So that's how you can end up with 325 trillion fruit flies in 3 months, descended from a single female. But it's J-shaped, and the fact that it's J-shaped means theoretically it could just keep going up and up and up and up forever. There's no stop to it because there's no limit to resources. That's the key. There's no limit to resources in exponential growth. It's the land of plenty. Everybody gets everything they need. There's no competition. We see a J-shaped curve with the human population. So I'm going to move my face over here so you can see this. This is really interesting. So here is human population growth. Right now, at the time of this recording, we have almost 8 billion people on this earth. 8 billion. That is a huge number. But if you look at the first human-like creatures were about 2 to 5 million years ago. And for the first 8,000 or so years, they were hunter-gatherers. And then we got the agricultural revolution. And so that started slightly increasing the population size. There was more resources to go around. But we're still so far under a billion at that point. So these are the number of billions of people. So we only had in the thousands, even as recently as 2,000 years ago. And then it started really, the agricultural revolution really started picking up, and we really started to see some population growth. And then the Black Plague happened. And so that wiped out all that progress. So we went back down to near zero. And then in about the 1700s, we entered the Industrial Revolution. So this is the point at which we introduced technology. So now we had medicines, we had machines, we had things to more quickly get out the resources we needed and to make sure everybody got those resources. So we saw increases in infant survivorship, and we saw decreases in mortality due to technology. And all of a sudden, whoosh, our population skyrocketed. So whereas it took 2 to 5 million years to reach the first billion people on Earth, it's taken less than 200 years to go up to almost 8 billion and climbing. So the question is, will we ever run out of those limited resources? We have technology, but can we recreate nature? And so if not, where will the cap to this population growth be? It clearly wasn't at 7 billion because now we're over that. Will it be at 10 billion, 14 billion? Will there ever be a cap? These are all interesting questions to ask. So if you look at every other species on Earth that's ever exhibited exponential growth, which is what the human population is exhibiting, it's never been able to be sustained indefinitely because of the limited resources. At some point, that exponential growth will start leveling off, and the curve will start looking like an S. And so that the top of that S is what's called carrying capacity, which we illustrate with a K. So carrying capacity produces what's called logistic population growth. So exponential is J-shaped curve. Logistic is where you have population growth rate that decreases as population size increases. So in other words, the more individuals you pack into a population, the more strain there is on resources. And now some individuals can't get the resources they need and die or fail to reproduce. And so the growth rate starts to slow down and level off as you approach carrying capacity. So carrying capacity is the population size at which everybody has exactly the resources they need, no more, no less. So as you start adding individuals here, you start feeling the crunch of each other and the strain on those resources, and the growth levels off at K. Now, sometimes you can overshoot K, in which case not every individual will get the resources they need. They die, and the graph starts coming back down to its carrying capacity. Or if they overshoot too much, everybody competes, nobody gets what they need, and the population crashes to extinction. So those are kind of the possibilities. So again, carrying capacity, or K, is the maximum population size of an organism that a given habitat can support through time, given the current resources. So what I was just mentioning about overshooting the carrying capacity, we have a little empirical example here. So here are some sheep in Tasmania. So they were introduced into Tasmania in about 1800, and they got there and they were like, oh yeah, we don't have our predators here. They're missing the wolves or whatever their predator was back on their homeland. And so they had an abundance of resources, and their population size skyrocketed. It grew exponentially for about 50 years. But they had grown so fast that they bred more than they had resources to support the population size. And so they overshot their carrying capacity, and therefore some individuals died. And so the population went below the carrying capacity. Well, if you're below carrying capacity, then you have a surplus of resources. So then the population increased again, and it overshot a little bit. So it went down, and started bobbing along the carrying capacity. So you can only figure out what a species' carrying capacity is after the fact, once you see the actual data of what went on. So, so they started hitting, overshooting carrying capacity about 50 years after their introduction, and by about 125 years after their introduction, they were a stable population. So zero population growth. Everybody was getting what they needed because you're bobbing along carrying capacity. So that's really what populations are shooting for, and that's what maintains the highest biodiversity. On the other hand, here's Alaskan reindeer. These guys were introduced into a certain area of Alaska in about 1910, and woohoo, look at all these resources we have that we didn't have in our homeland. So they started breeding like crazy, J-shaped curve, but at some point they overshot their carrying capacity, and they overshot it enough that the competition was so intense for the resources. They put such a strain on the resources that there was a crash. They all died and they went extinct very, very quickly. So, so those are, two possible outcomes of population growth. And we don't know where this reindeer's carrying capacity was. All we know is it overshot it. And so we can ask ourselves, for the human population, are we going to be able to grow exponentially, indefinitely, forever? Or if we do have a carrying capacity, are we going to be Tasmanian reindeer? Or sorry, Tasmanian sheep or Alaskan reindeer? Good question. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed learning about ecology. See you next time.